When I sat down to start going through video footage and begin the editing process for the stencil tips and tricks video, I felt like that video was a disservice to some of you. Allow me to explain. We talked about the tips and tricks in the beginning of the video. I showed you guys how I used the stencil to basically lay out the skull. But then I did what I always do. I went in and added all the texture and details just freehand. I talked about how an artist can use other tools and techniques in conjunction with the airbrush and still turn out some really nice work. Those that maybe don't quite have the fundamental control of their airbrush or just lack the confidence to go in and create some of these fine detailed lines. But I didn't show you guys how to do any of that. So this video, I hope, will remedy that. We're going to paint the same skull again using a different color, but I'm going to show you guys some other techniques that you can use as a beginner to still turn out a nice looking skull without having to worry about the confidence of going in and using those little bitty tiny freehand strokes. I titled this Beginner Techniques, but none of these techniques are technically beginner techniques. I still use these techniques that I'm going to show you all the time. So you can use them throughout your career. It's not just for beginners, but it is a good way for you guys to turn out some nice looking stuff early in your airbrush journey. So let's dive in. This process starts out very similar to what we did in the previous video, as far as using the stencil to create the roadmap of the skull. The difference this time is because I'm not going to use any freehand strokes to define the outline of the skull. I'm going to come in and spray a little bit more paint around the edges of the skull so we get a good defined edge. I'm using Illustration Violet for this demonstration just to do something different than what we did before. And it's reduced about 2 to 1, the same as what we did for the previous skull. So 2 parts paint to 1 part 4011 reducer. I'm also using a different airbrush in this demonstration. This is the GSI PS771. It's a 0.18 millimeter needle and nozzle set. It's a detail-oriented brush that is less expensive. It's about half the cost compared to the Iwata Microns. So it's more user-friendly from a budget standpoint for somebody who is beginning their airbrush journey. You see, I'm coming in a little bit heavier with the paint application around the edges of this stencil. Again, that's just to define those edges because I won't be coming in and using freehand strokes to do that for this demonstration. Now I'm fogging in a little bit of color on the shadowed side of this skull. I'm not necessarily trying to create texture like we did before. At this point, I'm just fogging in color to darken that area up to give us some contrast. There you can see the difference in the outline, especially around the teeth, because I won't be coming in and freehanding around individual teeth in this demonstration either. I'm using the stencil to create that hard edge. Same thing here. In a moment, I will create the hard edge for the gum line of those teeth using the stencil. So here I'm spraying about halfway on the stencil and halfway on the paper, maybe even a little bit more on the stencil, because I don't want to fill in all of these teeth with paint, and I'm being very careful and staying in the center of the stencil. I'm not getting too close to the edge. The overspray will allow the paint to drift to the edge because I'm not using tape around this stencil to protect the background, which is just going to be plain white from the overspray. Now you can use tape around your stencil, and I'll show you how you can do that here in a few minutes if you choose to do so. I chose not to use tape for almost all of this demonstration because I was hoping to get some overspray issues so that I can show you guys how easy it is to actually remove the overspray when it happens. Here's the example of using tape that I was just talking about. So you can put some masking tape around the areas that you don't want the overspray to get into, like the edges of the teeth, for example. With a little bit of tape, you can mask that off, and then you can spray and get a more defined edge along the edges of those teeth without having to worry about overspray getting where you don't want it. Coming in and darkening in some of these areas that we just sprayed, and there you can see now I can work all the way to the edge of the teeth because I've got tape protecting the outside edge. Same thing with these darker indentations on the sides with a little bit of masking tape around the edge. You don't have to worry about getting overspray onto your background. You can see how well defined those teeth are now, and you can also see I've got a little bit of overspray around the perimeter of this skull. It's very easy to remove with an eraser. Here I'm using an electric Helix eraser, but you can use just about any eraser that you want for this purpose. One thing that's really nice about the Illustration Createx line is it's very easy to erase, provided that you erase it soon. The longer the paint has time to dry, the harder it actually is to erase. So if you set this aside for a few hours, it's not going to be as easy to erase paint as it would be if you had just sprayed it. Putting the stencil back up, and you can use tape to hold your stencil down as well, so that I can begin filling in the nose and the eye sockets. The difference in this demonstration compared to what we did last time is I'm going to go ahead and commit. I'm going to darken all of these areas up pretty significantly. Remember to take your time and work in light layers. You don't want to hog the paint on. If you get a little bit too much paint, use air from the airbrush alone to dry it. So I'm gradually going to darken all of these areas up, pretty much to full saturation. I tried in this video to get some better camera angles as well so that you guys can see what I'm doing rather than having my hand and the airbrush blocking the view most of the time. You can really see how dark the eye and this nose socket is getting at this point. Again, I'm going to full saturation. I'm going to completely darken these up as dark as I can possibly get them with this color. Again, I chose to use no masking tape around any of these areas because I was hoping to get some overspray throughout this process so that I can show you not only how you can remove overspray from the background, but how you can fix overspray when you get it in your actual project, which you'll see here in just a minute. I'm actually getting some overspray in the top of the skull on that left hand side right next to the tape. When this portion of the stencil is removed, you'll be able to see the overspray created where it traveled over the stencil and landed along that tape edge as well as the stencil edge. And there you can see the overspray I was just talking about. Again, it's not a huge deal. I can come in with the Helix electric eraser and start to work that out. You'll notice I'm erasing in sort of a textured pattern. I'm not just going up and down or side to side. I'm actually putting a little bit of dot texture and different variations in there, trying to create a little bit of texture. And you can see it's not completely gone yet, but that's okay. We'll work on it a little bit more. And you can use just about any eraser to get rid of your overspray, especially in the perimeter. Here I'm using an ink/pencil eraser that's very worn. I've had this one for a while, to get rid of some of the overspray in the perimeter of this image. I can also use it in the skull itself to work on a little bit of that overspray in that top left corner. Again, it's not completely gone at this point. I still see a faint line of overspray up there, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be completely removed. We can use some other techniques here in a little bit to kind of change that and make it look like texture or part of the skull. Now I'm bringing the outline of the stencil back on to our project, and we can start building some texture. Now in the previous video I showed you guys how to build texture with just the airbrush alone. This time I am using the Gerald Mendez Texture Effects stencils, at least one of them. This is a very easy way to create texture in your artwork. And you'll notice that I'm moving the stencil around while I'm spraying through it. That gives you a softer, more diffused texture pattern compared to just setting the stencil on your project and spraying through all of the holes in the stencil. You can also get a more diffused look if you hold the stencil away from your canvas just slightly rather than setting it directly onto the surface. I talked about using these stencils in conjunction with freehand airbrush artwork, and that's usually how I prefer to do it in the previous video. This time we're going to use only the texture stencils to really create some of that texture. You can also see I just fogged in some paint on the left side of the skull. Now remember our light source, I haven't changed that on this project. The light source is still coming from the top left, so the right side of the skull should be darker because it's in shadow. The left side will be lighter. Again, because we are not using freehand strokes to create this particular skull, I'm using the stencil to create those hard edges, and we need some color even on the lighter side of the skull just to give contrast between the artwork and the white background. Fogging in a little bit more color on the shadowed side of the skull. I'm not necessarily trying to create texture like we did previously. I'm just fogging in color, but it is somewhat textured because I'm not trying to apply a smooth, even layer of paint either. working on that cheek area, again defining that edge of the skull with the help of the stencil itself. Another way you can create texture, if you don't have a texture stencil that you've purchased, is using a dryer sheet. This is a used dryer sheet. You do want to use the dryer sheet in your dryer before you attempt this, so that you can remove all of whatever they put on the dryer sheets, but that creates a nice little texture effect as well. I just wanted to show that to give you another option compared to actually purchasing a texture stencil. The nice thing about these texture stencils is I use them in just about everything I do. They're super handy. It's a very quick and easy method to create some believable texture effects in just about anything you paint. Now for the teeth. Again, I'm not going to come in and freehand around each one of these teeth. We have the top gum line established and we have the bottom of the teeth established, but now we need a little bit of a separation between those teeth. So I brought a piece of copy paper. This is just a 20-pound piece of cheap copy paper up, and I'm using that as a shield in order to add just a little bit of a line in between these teeth to separate them. You can see I'm spraying off to the side on the paper first, and then I'm bringing it over to the tooth. Barely putting any paint in that area. You don't need a line separating from top to bottom between all of these teeth. Just a little bit of a hint of that line is all you really need. Your brain will put that together and you'll see the separation. You can see right there. That looks pretty good for very little work, and you don't have to go in and freehand very small lines in between all of these teeth. It's a different look. These teeth look, I would say, more healthy compared to the skull we painted previously, because they're cleaner, they're a lot sharper. But this is a way that you can create that separation very easily without having to worry about the confidence of going in with very small freehand strokes. Now I'm tearing the piece of paper to use as another shield in order to create some of the shadows above these teeth. So that ripped paper edge gives a nice broken edge compared to just a straight edge for these shadows. And I'm just barely fogging some paint in there, trying to keep it off the top of the teeth, which are already pretty dark. If you get a little bit of overspray on the teeth, that's okay. I just did it right there. But again, spraying about halfway on the piece of paper and halfway onto the artwork. And you can see it's kind of creating some subtle little high and low spots in between all of these teeth. Essentially, this is the same effect that I used in the previous skull, but I created all of that with freehand strokes. You'll notice I was also moving the piece of paper around, not using the exact same ripped edge for every single shadow. Coming around, defining the left edge of the skull a little bit before we remove the stencil. Adding a little bit of texture on that left side as well. You're not going to have texture only in the shadowed areas. I'm keeping it a little bit lighter on that left side compared to the right. Now I want to darken in the shadows on the sides of the skull where that defined line is from the stencil itself. Again, I just tore a little bit of paper off of what we previously used in roughly the same shape. It doesn't have to be exact. And now I can use that to shield the rest of the skull so that we can come in and darken in these areas. Now this isn't going to be perfect because the shape does not exactly match what we created with the stencil itself. You see there, I've got a little bit of a gap on the bottom edge. That's okay, we'll fix that here in just a minute. I'm going to make sure that the paint is dry on this piece of paper before I flip it over to do the other side. And I'm going to repeat the same process, adding paint and darkening this little area up, putting it in shadow. I'm also going to carry this shadow a little bit further than I really want to, just so that I can show you how you can correct that if you get a little bit too dark. Again, you can see a little bit of a gap there at the bottom. That's okay, I just bring the piece of paper down and I can add some more paint into that area. That looks pretty good. I got a little bit heavy on the paint and drug a little bit of that paint down. That's okay, we'll fix that here in a few minutes. This is what I was talking about. That looked pretty good just a second ago, but now I'm going to continue adding some more paint to the top of it and get this a little bit darker than I would like. And this is so that I can show you how you can go in and repair this. That's pretty dark all the way up. I would rather have it fading out up into the lighter portion of the skull. Here you see I'm doing the same thing on the other side, using the paper mask again to close that little bit of a gap that was slightly off. Making sure it's dry. Now I can remove the outside of the stencil, and you can see I've got some overspray around in the background. Again, I'm just going to come in with an eraser and remove all of that relatively easily. Like I mentioned before, you can also choose to put masking tape around the areas that you don't want overspray when you are doing something like this, and that will save you a little bit of time because you don't have to go back and remove any overspray. I again wanted to create overspray, or I was hoping I would get some overspray throughout this project just so that I could show you how easy it is to remove. You don't have to panic. It's not hard to repair overspray, especially around the outside of your design. Here I'm using the Helix to sharpen up the edges around the perimeter of the skull. And this skull looks pretty dark compared to what we did last time. The difference between this project and the last project is I'm using subtractive techniques because I don't want to come in and do all this with freehand strokes in the airbrush. So now I'm coming in with the eraser and I'm removing paint to create both texture as well as highlights on the left side of this skull. Again, using a random dot type pattern to create some texture. I'm not using a lot of pressure with the eraser. I don't want to remove the paint completely so that it's just completely back to the white background. I want to remove it gradually and in stages and create just some texture, some interest. And I'm also adding a little bit of texture on the shadowed side with the eraser. Not a lot. Again, this is one of those things where a less is more approach is going to serve you well. The eraser is not only used to create texture, I can also create a lot of other highlights, and we will during this process. You can see I'm using it to create a little bit of a highlight underneath the eye sockets. And these are preliminary highlights. This is kind of a back and forth process. So we can add paint, we can remove paint, we can add paint, we can remove paint. Adding some texture in that cheekbone area, and you can see I tried to get rid of a little bit of that paint that I drug down when we created that dark shadowed area. Didn't get it completely gone, but we will work on that again in the future. This is what I was talking about a few minutes ago, repairing this little mistake. I got a little bit too dark in this shadowed area on the left side of the skull. So now I've come in with a pencil eraser, and I have two different types of pencil erasers. I have a non-aggressive pencil eraser, which is this one that I'm using now, that is essentially the same type of eraser that you would find on the end of a number 2 pencil. And you can see it's removing some of the paint, but it's not removing it very aggressively. Again, that was a non-aggressive pencil eraser. This is my aggressive pencil eraser. This eraser is a harder eraser, and it will remove paint a lot more efficiently and a lot more quickly. So I'm trying to fade that shadow back into the highlight by erasing some of this paint. And this eraser is doing a pretty good job of lightening that area up. It's a lot easier to add paint later versus removing it. But I wanted to show you guys that it can be removed if you make a mistake and really need to get rid of some paint. Again, this paint is relatively easy to remove when it's fresh. If you allow it to cure, or if you allow it to dry for 20-30 minutes or more, it becomes a lot harder to erase. Now that doesn't look spectacular, but I can come back in with the airbrush now and just fog a little bit of color over that area to blend the erased portion in with the darker shadow portion. And that looks better than it did just a few minutes ago. Back in with the electric eraser now, adding some more of these little highlights. One of the nice things about the electric erasers is you can get some very fine, sharp lines with that eraser compared to, say, a pencil eraser. Now coming back in to create some texture as well as try to remove those two little dark spots that I drug down when we created that shadow. Again, moving in random patterns, just trying to create texture and interest. A little bit on the shadowed side as well. Now moving down above these teeth. We've already created the shadows with that torn piece of paper. Now I want to come in and bring the highlights in between those shadows. So you can see there's some pretty defined edges in the shadows where the torn piece of paper was placed onto the canvas, but you can disguise that with the eraser by erasing the highlight along that line. Kind of breaks up the fact that we used a stencil or freehand shield, more or less, to create those shadows. Now coming in with the eraser, you can kind of blend that harsh edge from the paper away, and you're also adding highlights and texture at the same time. I'm getting a little more aggressive where I had that little mistake on the left side, and that's okay because this is the highlight side, so we want some brighter highlights on this left side anyway. If this wasn't on the highlight side, then we could easily come back in and add a light layer of paint as well to darken it back up. Working this texture throughout the skull now with the eraser, and I'm also using a more aggressive eraser tip in the electric eraser at this point. I mentioned the aggressive and the less aggressive pencil erasers earlier. There's also options for your electric eraser. A little bit of a spot of violet paint there on the top of that tooth that I wasn't happy with, so with the eraser I pretty well removed that. I can still see a very small portion of it. That's okay. This is what I was talking about a minute ago too, is how you can get some super fine detail with an electric eraser. Now I'm coming in and just adding a highlight at the top of each one of these teeth. Same thing that I did in the previous example, with the exception of I was using an airbrush and paint to create the highlights. Now I can come in and add a little bit more detail into these teeth, because these teeth look really nice. They were pretty much filled in with nothing but overspray, but we can add a few more little details with the eraser and really kind of bring them to life. The details doesn't have to be just texture with your eraser. I just created a few little lines on that left side of the cheek with the eraser as well, which is texture, but it's also some subtle details. Basically, again, the same thing that I did in the previous skull, with the exception of I was using an airbrush in the first example, and in this example I'm using an electric eraser. Bringing the stencil back in because I want to darken up the right side of this cheek, and this will again give me a very nice defined edge for the skull itself, but it also allows me to darken this area up because the right side is in shadow. So I'll darken around the edges, and then we'll probably come back in with the texture effect stencil and add just a little bit of more texture into that area as well. You also notice that I'm using the smaller dot patterns on this particular stencil. That's just due to the size of this skull. If it was larger, I would use some of the larger dot patterns. There's also two different versions of this particular stencil. There's a small version and there's a larger version. I am using the smaller version in this demonstration. Also using the texture effect stencil to add a little bit of texture there above the teeth. And now I wasn't very happy with how dark the shadows were between these teeth on the shadowed side, so I brought my piece of paper back in to use as a shield, the torn piece, and you can see I'm doing the same thing that we did between the teeth. I'm spraying on the paper first, and then I'm bringing it up and just adding some more shading in between the teeth on this shadowed side. You might be thinking, well, now you're erasing the highlights and texture that you just created a little bit ago. And you're right, but we're not completely erasing it. You can still see some of that texture through the darker shadows, and we'll come back in with the eraser and add the highlights back in. You see I got a little bit of paint in the tops of some of these teeth. That's okay. I can come in with the eraser and kind of texture that up just a little bit to disguise that particular mistake. Now I'm looking for a way to create that dark shadow between the nose socket and the eye sockets. And I found a shape on the stencil that will work pretty good for that. There's some other shapes right next to this particular shape, so I'm going to use some tape to control overspray around this particular shape. Now I can line it up to about where I want it, and I'm going to use the airbrush to darken this area up and create that shadow. Very similar to what we did in the first skull. I'm aiming for the top of this particular cutout on the stencil and then allowing the paint to fade down. I don't want to bring the paint too far down, and right there I actually did. I don't like how abrupt that transition is, so I've jumped in with the aggressive pencil eraser and I'm trying to blend this out. This mistake was not done intentionally. This was completely on me. But you can see using the aggressive pencil eraser how I can erase some of that overspray that was falling down further than I wanted it to, and now I'm trying to blend some of that up. The electric eraser will help in this endeavor as well. Creating texture and dots, random patterns. And now I don't see the blend lines below the shadow anymore, but I'm still not happy with the transition. So I've come back in with the airbrush and I'm going to just lightly fog a little bit of this violet color around that area to help blend it back in. Not doing anything intricate, there's no fine lines or anything. This is just fogging a little bit of paint into that area, and you can see right there that it's blending out a lot nicer than it was just a minute ago. And I can come back with the eraser and add a little bit more highlight texture, reestablish the highlights along the edge of the nose socket, and a little bit of texture below that shadowed area. Same thing on the other side, using the same portion of the stencil. I've flipped it over obviously, so the tape is now on the back side. I'm going to add a little bit of color in here to create this shadow. Now this looks like my alignment might be slightly off, so I'm going to pull it away after I add a little bit of paint. And yeah, you can see I was pretty close to that eye socket, so I've adjusted the placement of the stencil. And now I'm going to come in and do the same thing we did on the other side. Just darken this area up to create that dark shadow in between the nose socket and the eye socket. Same thing, I can use erasers to kind of blend the bottom edge of this back out and hopefully make it look a little more appealing to the eye. reestablishing the highlight there around the actual eye socket and the nose socket. And that looks pretty good. Now I'm looking for a shape that I can use to create the shadow in the brow area right above the nose socket. And I think the eyes themselves are probably going to be the best bet for this purpose. So I'm using the stencil to shield the highlight area, and I'm just adding a little bit of paint in between. Being very careful here. I'm concentrating the spray in one area more or less and allowing the overspray to drift up and down to create that shadow. Now I'm going to repeat the same process on the other side. Again, concentrating the spray in one particular area, allowing the overspray to drift up as well as drift down to create this shadow. Now this shadow is going to be a little more harsh in this example because we're not using any freehand strokes. You can see it didn't line up exactly, but that's okay. I can adjust the stencil and fill in that little area, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now that transition is a little bit sharper compared to the previous example. We can come in with the electric eraser and add some texture and highlights in that area and try to clean that up a little bit. It's a little more harsh than I would like, but overall it looks pretty nice for an example of an airbrush painting where we haven't used really any fine line detail with the airbrush itself. Again, coming in with the electric eraser and just adding some highlights within the shadow as well as the top of that nose socket. And this is what I was talking about, trying to get rid of that harsh corner as well as adding a little bit of texture and further highlights in this particular area. Same thing on the other side. I'll add a little bit of texture, not quite as much because this is more on the shadowed side. And now for the crack. Rather than coming in and doing this freehand, I chose to grab our piece of paper, and I'm using an X-Acto blade to cut a small crack into this piece of paper, and we will use this as a stencil in order to create this crack. I don't recommend that you cut directly on the surface that you're painting. I would recommend cutting this somewhere else unless you're pretty experienced with cutting with the razor blade so that you don't cut through and into your actual project. I was doing this for the camera And then do your best to line it up where you want it. And I'm going to take the airbrush and spray directly through this stencil. And that creates essentially the same crack that we had in the previous example. Now I can come back in with the eraser and clean up the top edge where there was a little bit of overspray there. You can also add some highlights to the crack and maybe some last minute little touches as far as highlights are concerned with the erasers, but for the most part this one is just about finished. Now to add the eyes in this particular example, I chose to come in and map out where I wanted them with the eraser first. And I actually got the eye on the left side there a little bit off. I think it needs to be brought in further to more closely resemble the eyes that we did in the previous example. That's okay. We can repair that here in just a few minutes. The downside with the eraser is you can't get that glow effect with the eraser. You need the airbrush for that particular effect. So now I've switched to Illustration Opaque White. This is reduced about 2 to 1, same as the Violet, 2 parts paint and 1 part 4011 reducer. And I'm coming in and just fogging in some white in these highlight areas. I'm not trying to create texture with the airbrush. This is just fogging in a little bit of color to add some white into the painting, because I'm going to add white into the eyes. I want a little bit of white in the painting itself because this white paint may not exactly match the white background of this piece of paper. And you can also use the white to lighten up some areas if you think you got a little bit too dark. And you can also use the texture effect stencil to add some texture with the white as well. Again, I wasn't happy with the placement of the eye on the left side, so now I've switched back to my Violet and I'm going to paint over that eye, and then we will move it so that it looks a little bit better. Again, make sure you dry the paint with air from the airbrush as you go. I'm spraying this pretty heavy, trying to cover that white area up. And now I'll come back in with the eraser and put my little highlight mark where I should have put it in the first place. Now I can repeat the same process. I'll come back in with the white paint and put that little glow into that eye. And then we'll bring the stencil in and highlight the very bottom edge of these eyes, and I think we'll call this one finished. And that pretty much wraps this one up. That was 2 very different approaches to painting the same thing, and both yield very nice results. So I hope that illustrates my point that regardless of where you are at in your airbrush journey, you can still turn out some really nice artwork using some of these other tools and techniques that I showed you in this video. Now, I'm not saying that's an excuse not to continue to practice and improve, because let's face it, freehand is king when it comes to airbrush. When you get to the point where you can freehand well, then you can pretty much paint anything you want. And at that point, you can start to combine the techniques between both of these examples, and that's how you really take your work to the next level. I think one of the big takeaways from this particular video is remember to work in light layers. It's always easier to come back later and add more paint if you need to darken something up versus trying to remove paint when you need something to be lighter. So as always, I'll leave links in the description below to all of the products that I use throughout this video. They are affiliate links, so if you choose to make a purchase and you're using one of those links, I get a very small percentage of that sale at no additional cost to you, which helps to support the channel, and I appreciate that very much. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I'll see you guys next time.